let's talk about Southeast Asia. So this is one of the fastest growing regions in the entire world. As of just in the last few months, actually, the total amount of exports from Southeast Asia to the US as a region eclipsed that of the Chinese economy. It's also standing at geographically, it stands at a really important crossroads kind of between India and China. And it also controls the Malacca Strait, which is kind of like the Suez Canal of the South Chinese Ocean.
People don't know that it's actually one of the most busy and important ports in the entire world, like historically as well, like in terms of connecting like the Indian Ocean maritime trade, and even just today, right? I feel like between two of the Asian giants, right, India and China, countries like Singapore are so important to today's global infrastructure.
No, I mean even Indonesia itself is like, I think just recently it's either near or eclipsed the population of the U.S. It's like around 400 million, which is pretty incredible. And the actual mass of the country, if you include the oceans, is also about the same size.
It's also the highest. People don't know this, but it has the highest number of Muslims in the entire world.
Yeah. More than right.
No one just ever seems to talk about Southeast Asia or know what it is, right? I mean, it's literally as a region, the 5th largest economy in the world. This is funny. Like I was at a party in Singapore, right? And I was meeting this guy. His name was Amar, and this Indian guy from Texas, right? So he's like, this is my first time in East Asia. And all of us were like, dude, you're in Southeast Asia. And this guy had no idea that it was a completely different region of the world. Now, obviously, maybe that's just him personally, but I feel like in general, like Southeast Asia as a regional, discrete region, right, isn't sort of very understood.
Yeah, exactly.
In many parts of the world, like they did think, oh, maybe it's just part of East Asia.
Yeah, people either confuse it with South Asia or East Asia. And then sometimes people will try and read it as kind of an amalgamation of the two, which I think is a bit of a reduction.
So why don't we kind of go over?
So I've a really interesting point to raise about the creation of Southeast Asia, because the actual region itself and the moniker Southeast Asia is not even 100 years old. So there's really interesting work by this famous public intellectual, Professor Wang Gungwu, who's like 93 years old, brilliant, very long and storied career, and he's basically argued like across several speeches and books that Southeast Asia only really goes back to World War II. And actually, as a region, I mean, obviously that there was a space that we now call Southeast Asia that was very richly populated with cultures and different ethnicities that obviously goes very, very far back into the medieval period and even before. But the actual concept of Southeast Asia as a kind of regional unit only comes out of World War II. And in particular, it was American and British military planners who first conceived of Southeast Asia. Before that, it just wasn't a thing. And it was part of the operations against the Japanese during the Second World War. They needed a kind of strategic military command to basically break this region down into a theater of military operations, and so they came up with the term Southeast Asia. And even in a term itself, you can sense some of the confusion because India is South Asia, and East Asia is China, Korea, and Japan predominantly. And so they basically said, okay, we're going to call this region Southeast Asia, and we're going to divide it up between American and British war planners. And it wasn't until 1967 where you have the first ASEAN, where Southeast Asia becomes like a body that's imagined by the actual people themselves. Prior to that, it was always someone from outside Southeast Asia, either the Japanese or the British or the Americans or the Europeans coming up with the terms.
Well, so, why don't we talk what is ASEAN? In fact, nobody knows what ASEAN.
Yeah, except they and the premier. Yeah. No, and that's part of the puzzle. It's that ASEAN itself is hard to define. It's an association of Southeast Asian nations. What's interesting is that when it comes together in 1967, this is the same year of the Sukarno regime gets replaced by Suharto in the Indonesian Revolution, and so actually the original Southeast Asia were only the countries in what we would now call the Malay Archipelago, or by its old Javanese name Nusantara, which is it was originally just Singapore, Malaysia, Indonesia.
right?
No, not Thailand.
Oh.
That's the thing. So in Indochina, or like what you would call
That's-
Indochina.
yeah, that's what-
Yeah, because it was controlled by the French, so it wasn't originally part of Southeast Asia. And the thing is that the only thing that they had in common, I mean, these are very different peoples, different ethnicities. Like
Yeah, people
like
don't-
Singapore, you have
Think about how many different religions,
exactly,
how many different languages there are. Like, what actually ties these people together?
exactly.
I think maybe it.
And then you would never guess what it was.
What?
Do you want to guess what it was that first tied them together?
What, the Khmer Empire?
No, it was anti-communism. That was the only thing that every Southeast Asian country had in 1967 in common, was
They
anti-communism.
went Vietnam.
Because you have and that's why Vietnam wasn't a part of it, because Vietnam was at the time. I mean, this is when the Vietnam War is kicking off. This is when Kennedy's starting to get involved and America's starting to deploy troops. I mean, if we take the Vietnam War is going from 65 to 75.
Yeah.
And so Southeast Asia comes together as a body of states who all have an interest in subverting communism. And that's the only thing that holds them together at the beginning. It's
What
the
about
fact
like
that-
Laos? 'Cause I feel like Laos.
Yeah, no, and so Indochina wasn't part of it. So Thailand, Burma, Vietnam joined later.
Okay, so why don't you tell us what was Indochina, which was
Yeah.
basically the French bloc.
This is
And what was
exactly,
the
it was a
British
French bloc. Yeah.
I guess the Americans and the Philippines. So it was literally divided by three then major. I guess you.
Yeah, exactly. You're right.
Why would you
You're-
say that? 'Cause I feel like a lot of people don't understand that. Obviously, in Singapore, we know that like
Yeah.
Singapore.
Yeah, so
British
basically,
colony,
yeah,
right?
okay. So
Everything's English there.
basically, you have what's called Indochina, and again, in the very name is because, you know, I mean, this is a Western colonial name for a region that's much more diverse, but that we want to capture simply. So we just called Indochina because it's not Indonesia, it's not India, it's not China. Like the whole idea of Indochina is that it's this kind of liminal space between India and China.
And
this
those
is-
countries or civilizations that encompass that.
Yeah, so that would be. I mean, I'm not familiar on the civilizations, but the modern day countries that would be Burma, Thailand, Vietnam, and Laos. That's Indochina.
Right, it's like-
Yeah, and because this was
I'm wrong, yeah.
this was part of the French sphere of influence. And then just south of that, what you have is the Nusantara archipelago, or like the Malay archipelago, and this is predominantly British. And you have the Dutch in Indonesia. You have the British in Malaysia and Singapore, and then you have the Americans in Philippines. Yeah, and so that's the other interesting point. It's when ASEAN was first being conceived of in 1945 by American and British war planners, it was basically a hodgepodge of different empires. You had
Right.
British, French, Dutch, English. No, sorry, British is English. British, French, Dutch, American.
American.
Right, and so that's what makes, I think, ASEAN so complicated to understand as a concept, because it itself has been constantly been under like negotiation and constantly being reworked. And so like one of the examples that Professor Wang Gungwu gives is that a lot of the early colonial academics and theorists who were coming up with Southeast Asia, they couldn't even agree which countries were part of it. So for example, some academics who would follow the definition given by the British Southeast Asian Command would exclude Philippines, because Philippines was part of what was essentially part of like what you would call the American Empire.
And it was Catholic, right? I
Yeah.
feel like there has to be some kind of religious tint to it. I think.
Yeah, of course.
The only-
And there's religion.
In Southeast Asia, Christian country.
I mean, Singapore is technically majority Christian as well.
True. You're right. So it's super complicated because
Yeah.
Malaysia is an Islamic country in terms of majority population. Obviously, in terms of the government, but Indonesia, Malaysia are some of the biggest Muslim populations.
Yeah, exactly.
And then you've got like Myanmar and Thailand, which are Buddhist,
Yeah.
right? Laos.
And let me throw you another one. So most of Southeast Asia ethnically are Malay. Like Indonesians and Malaysians both come from like what you would call like the Malay
An
ethnicity
ethnic group, yeah.
And guess where they came from? Guess where the Malaysian ethnicity originated from?
India?
No, it was Taiwan.
No,
It was Taiwan. They were seafarers who came down from Taiwan because Taiwan was, and that's the thing too. So there's also debate on whether Taiwan can be considered Southeast Asia, because the thing is, Taiwan geographically it's right at the mouth of the South China Sea that goes into Southeast Asia. So you can kind of look at it as a bridge, and that's why Taiwan was so important both to the Chinese and for the Japanese when Taiwan was a Japanese colony.
Wow.
So like that's why if you look at like people who are ethnically from the landmass of Taiwan today, they would generally have darker skin because they have more in common genetically with the Malay world. And so that's what's so interesting. Like the entire region itself is just a construction of different empires that have kind of bled in and out of it over the years. So there's, I mean, I'm not a big fan of stadial theory
Okay.
as a way of describing long arcs in history, but I think it's particularly useful for just to break down a really complex history like that of Southeast Asia, because if you go really far back for like the 8th and 9th century, you have the Dharmic civilizations from India that come into Southeast Asia first.
Yeah, I mean,
and they built these grand structures like Borobudur, like Angkor Wat. Was it all about
by those.
Yeah, exactly. But it was built by a population that was Hindu.
Or
So actually,
and Buddhist.
Yeah,
And
Hindu and
Angkor Wat
Buddhist. Yeah,
is-
so it was Hindu and Buddhist first, and then you have Islam coming through the trade routes as well.
Exactly.
And so
Islam also came to India too. Right?
Yes, and
around
so-
the time period of
And then, so then you have Islam in China, particularly at the height of the Abbasid Caliphate.
Wow. So we're talking about
And
pre
then-
1258 then.
Yeah, kind of 1258 going into
Dynasty that
yeah, exactly.
and that was crazy.
And then later on you had the European powers. So it was actually the Portuguese first.
right.
So Jakarta was actually first conquered by the Portuguese, and it was
People don't know
it was called and it was called a coconut port. It was like something Kalapa. It was like coconut port.
Wow.
And then it was taken over by the Dutch later. So it's kind of like
That's actually
you start off with the Hindu civilization, and you have India Hindu slash Buddhist, and then you have Muslim and Chinese,
yeah.
and then eventually you have European, and even then it's Portuguese first, then it's Dutch, and then it's British.
But you know what's
Going into the 19th century.
I think what's fascinating, right, is because again, like Southeast Asia very much was so interconnected between India and China, right? I think when you kind of notice how those countries kind of were responding to foreigners and responding to the advent of Islam and stuff, I feel like it totally makes sense that then those changes internally happening in those civilizations would also find its way to Southeast Asia, right? Like
Yeah,
the
exactly.
Portuguese were very much a coastal sort of civilization, right? And they would conquer India specifically like in Goa and like sort of like around the Mumbai area, right? And those links were very much well connected to Southeast Asia in terms of the sort of historic trade links that connect.
Yeah.
Same with
Yeah.
right? I mean, like you kind of can study like the Maja Fahid and sort of these empires.
Srivijaya.
Exactly, they were very much Buddhist, and then those collapsed to sort of an Islamic empire that kind of came afterward. Yeah. That's also around the same time that India was also facing a lot of turmoil from
Yeah.
Islamic countries, or sorry, civilizations and empires sort of coming into the country.
Oh yeah, you have there. Yeah, it's all
the
connected.
Mughals.
It's all connected.
Yeah, and so it's kind of fascinating. And it's always interesting, I mean, when you kind of go back to the Dharmic period, right? Like, I mean, there's sort of the saying that like Southeast Asia very much, even today, is still so culturally like,
Dharmic.
yeah, like you go to Thailand,
Yeah.
you go to like, you know, Cambodia, there's such a similarity, even in the languages, right? Like it's insane. Culturally, language, I mean, like even in terms of the textiles, there was such a big textile trade between the two. And even politically at some point, like in southern India, the Chola Empire was ruling, I think around the 12th century. And they literally were like kingmakers in parts of Southeast Asia at one point. Like they actually had an extension, like a political link to like Southeast Asia, which a lot of people don't understand that. I mean, even if you look at Singapore, right? Singapura is what? It's actually, I think it's a Sanskrit word, or maybe Tamil.
Yeah,
It comes
it's
from-
something like that. Yeah.
Exactly. Like it came from a Chola sort of seafarer that kind of discovered this land and kind of named it like after that, right? And that's kind of where the myth
Yeah.
is relying on.
Yeah, no, you're right, and that's interesting thing is that even like long before you have what we would now recognize as globalization, Southeast Asia was already at the center of like cross-cultural global
Yeah, dude.
interaction. And I think a good example is so Southeast Asia begins to convert to Buddhism like kind of around the turn of the 14th and into the 15th century.
Probably
And one of the interesting I mean sorry to Islam. If it gets to convert to Islam around that time, and one of the interesting theories I've heard as to why is that because you know Zheng famous voyages was in the late 14th and then early 15th century was his last voyage. And the thing is, because when when the Ming Dynasty was trading with Southeast Asia, a lot of Southeast Asia saw themselves as just vassals of the Ming Dynasty, and so they would pay tributes. And so Singapore during the time of Temasek in the 14th century itself was actually in way a vassal of the Ming Dynasty. And so what happens is after Zheng He's voyage, they get a whip of the fact that the Ming Dynasty is not going to be sending any more voyages down to Southeast Asia.
Yeah, because they were also exploring, of course.
Yeah, exactly, and they knew that, and so that's part of why Islam was able to seep into Southeast Asia so successfully, because China pulled away, and so this is one of the interesting theories I've heard, but it goes to show, I think, how its politics and culture, and I mean its history is so connected to what's happening all around the world.
That's actually such an important point, and I feel like we also, I mean, Southeast Asia deserves its own credit as its own regional sort of distinct identity that is definitely influenced by India and China, but also very much unique in its own right.
Oh yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean that's the thing, you know. It's like when you combine two very distinct cultures into one, and you create this.
And it had a local
sort of like realized exactly
its own kind of
and you create this realized society. The whole is not equal to the
sum of its parts.
To the sum of its parts, yeah. Exactly.
It's kind of, I mean, I feel like people don't also know this, but like, you know, the Khmer Empire, right? I think obviously that name has been sort of bastardized in many ways from the Khmer Rouge, which, if you know about in sort of modern Cambodian history with Pol Pot and sort of the genocide and all these awful things that happened sort of at the turn, well, I guess mid to late 20th century. But I think a lot of people don't know that the Khmer Empire was actually one of the biggest empires like ever historically. Like this city, like at its height, it controlled like Cambodia, like parts of Thailand, Laos, Vietnam, Myanmar. Like I think like its capital, which was probably where Angkor Wat was, like Angkor, it was the most populous city in the world at that time. Like more than London, more than Paris. I mean, obviously it sounds like more than parts of like India and China, but I feel like nobody sort of recognized.
And when was the Khmer Empire? Like when was it?
Between the 9th and the 15th century. I think its height like was probably when Angkor Wat was built, right? Which was at its peak in the 12th century. I think that's when Angkor Wat was built. Like, which obviously is actually the largest. I think it's the largest like piece of like structure of worship in the world. I think so. Like, I mean, if you've been there, which both of us had, and it's one of the most unbelievable things you've ever seen.
Yeah.
And I feel like now people think of Southeast Asia as like, great, Thailand, I can kind of just go and, you know, go for vacation or like find a hooker or whatever. Or Singapore is like a modern banking country, but like no one understands that historically this region was actually one of the most important parts.
Yeah, really the most important.
It's just that we don't.
Yeah, no, I think there's an argument to be made too that like Southeast Asia could be seen as a crucible of modernity and globalization and all these large words that we like to use to describe how the modern system came about. I mean, Southeast Asia was also a hub of colonialism. So it was also where you had a lot of these large merchant empires coming in and intermingling. And what a lot of people forget is that actually these joint stock companies, particularly the Dutch East India Company and the British East India Company, were both the first examples of what you would call like mercantile capitalism, because this was when these were companies that were taking investments from people, often through merchant banks, and those merchant banks would then would develop into what we call investment banks of today, and so a lot of the financial system was actually just built through the spice trade within Southeast Asia. Yeah, and even
how come like not in India and not in other places?
I mean, obviously all these places too, but I think but I think. But the importance of Southeast Asia is that it connected these large bodies, if you think about it, because the thing is you could travel much faster and haul much more cargo with large ships sailing around the Indian Ocean into South through the Malacca Strait into Southeast Asia and then up to the South China Sea. Because the thing is, for most of history until the colonial period and even after the colonial period, it was the Islamic and the Islamic empires and the Chinese empires that were the richest, largest, and most prosperous in the world.
Yes.
And so Southeast Asia geographically was like the ocean bridge that connected these routes. And so that's why. So you're right. it's not just Southeast Asia that these colonial empires are interested in trading with.
There, because I feel like there was actually a lot more competition, because I think it's the only part of the world that was actually divided up. Obviously, like Africa was.
Yeah, it was divided up.
It was divided up between like major colonial.
Yeah, much.
It was not, right? The way
Exactly.
China also, I guess, was not either, right? I think that the British had way more of an influence.
Well, China was divided up, but that was about mid to late 19th.
But it wasn't fully colonized.
And same with Africa.
Yeah, they're not fully colonized. They're just economic.
And that's because it just had such an important strategic location. Because the thing is, if you sail through the Malacca Strait rather than around Java and Sumatra and around like circumnavigating the Malay archipelago, you save like many days of seafaring. It's just insane, and that's why like this particular strait is so strategic, and that's why every European power wanted to set up some kind of outpost in around that area. This is one of the things that actually came out recently of research on Singaporean history, is that every single major European empire had active plan to colonize Singapore because they recognized that it was pertinent to controlling the what you would call the Silk Road of the Sea that was going through the
maritime.
Yeah, exactly. That was going through this area.
Wasn't also like I think it was also a site of like proper international law that we look at today. It was
Exactly. So there's also
kind of mix of.
So there's an interesting book by this another historian of Singapore, Peter Borschberg, who actually began as an intellectual historian of international law. He was studying Hugo Grotius, the Dutch humanist who is often credited as being the first person to come up with the concept of international humanitarian law.
Mm-hmm.
And what he found is that a lot of his ideas, he developed a lot of his ideas when he was litigating. He was hired by the Dutch East India Company as a litigator because there were so many, with such a complex political and geographical space like Southeast Asia, they were running into all of these legal issues surrounding sovereignty and trade and treaties.
Probably maritime law.
And maritime law, exactly. And so Hugo Grotius actually, he was a litigator for the VOC, the Dutch East India Company, and it was during that time that he came up with a lot of his ideas that went on to become the foundation for what you would call international humanitarian law. And even Southeast Asia itself was filled with different legal issues surrounding sovereignty and disputes. And so again, I think this goes to my original point that there's also one framework where we look at Southeast Asia as like a crucible of a lot of the institutions and systems that we now consider a part of the modern world.
Right, so international law.
Yeah, international law.
Globalization.
Exactly, globalization, international economics. Yeah.
And then like even today, I feel like it's actually a region that has so much more importance than it deserves. I don't know, I feel like...
Yeah, or that is often credited with, yeah.
Exactly. I mean, I think if you kind of combine them together, it's the 5th largest economy, right? The GDP.
And it's also the fastest growing too. It's one of the fastest growing, and it's one of the... I think it's one of the economies with the most potential for growth, because a lot of the major developed economies, even China now, are slowing down in terms of birth rate and growth. And in fact, what you see is like a lot of manufacturing, because there's now so much aversion to China in an age of polarization. You have a lot of manufacturing and labor leaving to parts of Southeast Asia, such as like Malaysia and Indonesia, where there's still a huge availability of cheap labor. Yeah, because that's what China used.
And they have good infrastructure in their cities.
Well, I don't know. I mean, depends. I don't know about good infrastructure.
But comparatively,
yeah. What else? Sure.
One of the major things
comparatively,
the India boom is literally just the infrastructure of their city. They are just not primed enough to be able to handle this growth opportunity that they've been given. And I feel like in Southeast Asia, it is. I mean, obviously we've been around. Like they're very like nice cities that just function and work in many ways. Like Bali, crazy traffic. Bangkok has its own energy, but still,
a traffic simulator.
I feel like there is like a lot more that can allow like a foreign company to want to set up shop there, right? That's
for sure. Or and that's the thing. So going back to the earlier point about ASEAN, the concept of ASEAN got a lot of support and recognition in the West, and it was because what they realized is that they all had a common interest in preventing communism.
Yeah.
And so it's like I mean, the U.S. was going into Vietnam to basically stop the spread of communism, and so they were happy to see a group of states right below that space geographically, that were basically renouncing communism as part of their regional identity, and so part of what makes ASEAN so successful is precisely the fact that its geopolitical aims, around when it was being created in the 1960s and onwards, aligned perfectly with both. I use Western broadly, but this is already the age of American empire, or quote unquote American empire.
Right.
So it just like the foundational concept of ASEAN melded so amazingly with what the British and the Americans wanted in the region anyways. And there's this fantastic book that covers this called Arc of Containment, which basically just shows how it goes into domino theory during the Vietnam War and the desire to contain communism, and basically just shows how how ASEAN fit in so perfectly with US geopolitical aims in the region.
But it also,
and that's also why the US through the CIA was actually one of the biggest supporters of the Indonesian Revolution. People don't often recognize that because they were happy to see a communist regime get overthrown by an anti-communist regime, and there's all these.
was Pope?
I'm honestly not well versed on Indochina, and Pol.
I think it's interesting how this sort of organization has evolved itself in modern times, because actually it's such an amalgamation of different countries now. I mean, you have like an authoritarian sort of state like Myanmar in there. You've got Islamic countries. You've got very sort of anglicized countries like Singapore, Indonesia. I mean, it's just such a crazy mix of countries that I think people don't recognize that it's kind of fascinating how this bloc has has survived and basically evolved itself, right?
No way. And just to,
because Vietnam only joined Brunei's there too. Yeah, Vietnam joined.
Yeah, just to hammer home the point. Look at when Indochina joins ASEAN. It's the 1990s.
So,
and what's significant about that in terms of world history? It's after the Cold War ends. And so if you add together, you can see how, and even now today, I think Professor Wang also makes the point that Vietnam now has become more and more anti-communist and more allied with the U.S., which would have been inconceivable during the Vietnam War, and so in a way, the ASEAN that we have today was only conceivable the ASEAN that we have today, which unites the geographical space of Indochina and the Malay Archipelago, is only conceivable in a post-Cold War world.
I think it's fascinating because, I don't know. I feel like there are not any other sort of comparable organizations like ASEAN that's they're such diverse areas. I feel like OPEC, oil, or EU, they're all European. I guess European itself is another sort of question or a block, but realistically, they're all sort of come from that same Christian background, same the diversity just isn't there the way in Southeast Asia, the way ASEAN has it, and the way it's evolved itself. I think it's such a unique block, and I feel like nobody really understands it.
No, and that's the thing. People like to group these big terms and kind of reduce them. To quote my old advisor here, Adam Tooze, people like to say countries like Indonesia, which is an oxymoron because there's no country like Indonesia. There is no country in the world with 400 million people that operates a geographical space the size of the U.S., but which is mostly water. The Indonesian archipelago itself is something like 10,000 islands. Just imagine, which is a political nightmare. I mean, just imagine, the U.S.
That's what.
Exactly. It's just
it's main language.
There's just an incredible amount of language and it's actually one of the most diverse countries in the world in terms of language, ethnicity, and culture.
Underrepresented.
Yeah, exactly. In terms of
media, in terms of filmmaking, music.
Yeah, or sure. When it is, it's often just kind of treated as just like another third world country.
Yeah, one of my friends, he literally he's Indonesian and he's a filmmaker, and I was always how come with such a large population of people, how come there is such a small kind of sort of footprint of just Indonesian cultural content that is sort of traversing the world.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating. I feel like there's definitely going to be a time where we're going to see that dynamic very quickly change, right? Especially as the world especially as the U.S. and China now are even more focused. I think kind of going back to what you said about ASEAN, how there was, it could sort of succeed in a post-Cold War environment. I think now the main challenge, right, is the sort of U.S.-China rivalry and how the countries sort of want to respond to that, and what side they want to pick or what they don't want to pick.
Exactly. No, and what's interesting too is that I think Southeast Asia plays a similar role in like an age of U.S. China as it always has, because in many ways, I mean, in many ways, it's right in the center of the conflict. Because it carries, you know, I mean, it's a major trade route. It's geographically important. So,
They're tied
for
with
example, the U.S. Pacific Fleet is parked in Singapore, and it's not by coincidence. It's because Singapore controls literally controls the mouth of the Malacca Strait, which is where almost all like a very large chunk of maritime international trade flows through every year. And so for example, like one strategic vision for like if there ever is U.S. China is I should just put it this way. I think that strait is absolutely crucial to in a world of U.S. China tension.
Of course.
Particularly, you know, if there's economic sanctions, trade sanctions, that would be where you would want to basically set up a kind of customs checkpoint.
But think about also the cultural conflict, right? I mean, 70% of Singapore's population is basically ethnically Chinese, right? And so it's a very interesting kind of sort of melting pot you've got going on, where I think like politically and economically, I think people are very much behind the U.S., but also culturally, there's so much connection to China, right? Of course, it's different based off of which Southeast Asian country that you're in, right? Of course, like a lot of other countries have a lot of more problems with the South China Sea and sort of like border disputes, like, you know, between Philippines and Vietnam and sort of China.
Yeah, and even in predominantly Malay societies like Malaysia and Indonesia, oftentimes like you have like these like Creole cultures of like Chindos, Chinese Indonesians, or like Chinese Malays, and oftentimes they do very well socioeconomically. Like I'm not familiar with the statistics, but I would wager that they're disproportionately represented in the higher socioeconomic classes, and so you have these very interesting
Dynamics.
Yeah, these very interesting kind of demographic problems where the Chinese ethnicity is supposed to be a minority in Southeast Asia, yet they control a disproportionate amount of its wealth. Yet at the same time, they're profoundly anti-communist, going back to the ASEAN point. And so what you had here are Singaporeans. So yeah, exactly. And so what you get is this really interesting like problem where you have a region where you have a lot of powerful ethnically Chinese players, but they don't see themselves as connected to the CCP. Or China in general. Like they don't see themselves as part of this grand Chinese civilizational framework. They're very much, you know, I mean, they're Southeast Asian. They just happen to be ethnic.
I mean, you're like Peranakan. I think people also don't even know what the hell that is, but it's like...
Yeah, exactly. They just appear to be...
Yeah, but you're not.
They just happen to be Chinese in the same way that, you know, you have a lot of like Americans who just happen to be ethnically European.
Right.
So it's really
like African origins
who
in Jamaica.
Who have no connection to Europe. So it's the same thing in Southeast Asia.
Exactly. I think it's definitely going to be more of a geopolitical battleground of the coming years, especially, and also the Indo-Pacific region, right? Indo-Pacific region is very much honestly can subsume a lot of the Southeast Asian region in some sense, but like, yeah, it's definitely going to be increasingly a center of this competition for influence, right, between U.S. and China. And unfortunately, we're in a world of a lot more conflicts, right? And I feel like it could definitely be another theater for sure, especially like if there's a hypothetical scenario between China and Taiwan that's going to bring the U.S. Like Southeast Asia is going to be a major theater of where this action is going to be taking place.
Oh, for sure. And the thing happened during the Cold War. You know, the Cold War was never cold in Southeast Asia. Again, to quote Professor Wong, and Southeast Asia was the battleground in many ways for where the Cold War took place. Because I mean, even like the 1950s and 60s in Southeast Asia were defined by a struggle between communist political parties and their anti-communist challengers, and like you see this with the Malayan emergency in Malaya, which bled into Singapore, with Operation Cold Store, with Indonesian Revolution. So, and there were huge amounts of deaths and killing between communists and anti-communists. So the whole idea that the Cold War was a Cold War is only true if you ignore Southeast Asia.
Yeah.
Because the thing is, Southeast Asia was quite literally the physical battleground for the Cold War.
Percent.
So the entire, like, the very moniker and concept Cold War is
Very Euro perspective.
yeah, exactly. It is a Euro. It
Not that you're actually involved in fighting the war. I mean, to sort of, I mean, yeah, absolutely.
And the thing is, it was also where the Cold War was won, arguably. I mean, if you're, just kind of recapitulating everything we said, ASEAN develops as an anti-communist kind of political body, and that's because the anti-communists won the battle in all of those countries. And then with the end of the Cold War in the 1990s, I mean, and even before that, I mean, the Indochina becomes more and more anti-communist.
So fascinating.
And so, yeah, and so there's these different layers, I think, to understanding Southeast Asia, and the extension, and then the extension of that then is that Southeast Asia is itself a product of the Cold War. Like the actual concept of Southeast Asia,
Like you said,
cannot be traced back further than
until when the Iron
further than the Cold War, because as a concept it's built by, it's a product of the Cold War, and so any attempt to look further back into Southeast Asian history is itself a bit of an anachronism. Because the thing is, if Southeast Asia just doesn't exist until like the mid 20th century, which is very, very recent, it's like literally, like our parents and grandparents grew up before Southeast Asia became a thing. So then any attempt to go further back into Southeast Asia history means that we're creating something totally novel.
Right.
We're in a sense back projecting. Right, because now his
There was its own
exactly, because now
qualities that were sort of exactly.
Yeah, so it was this conglomeration of like Srivijaya, Majapahit, Khmer, European merchant empires,
Of course.
but never at any point until like the 1960s would we recognize its geographical space as Southeast Asia.
Yeah, and I think this region is going to definitely be more and more defined and kind of come more in the spotlight as I think the next years progress. Like I think as we discussed from an economic perspective,
for sure.
It's one of the largest economies. From a population perspective, it's actually has one of the youngest populations in the world, right? I think like over 60% are under 35. Definitely interesting to kind of talk more about it, understand the region, and I really hope that people kind of got a better understanding of what this region is, what its history is, and kind of what its future is going to be, and kind of how much more important it's going to have, I think, on the world stage.
For sure.